So that's great. And what I would like to do in the next couple of minutes is really look at lessons for the post-COVID world of work, and zooming in particular on universal social protection as a driver for an inclusive, resilient, and sustainable recovery. And with that, we're going to jump right in, if I manage to move my slides. Yes. So basically, my presentation has 3 parts. So starting with the question of where do we stand at the moment? Still in the middle of the COVID crisis, trying to get out of it. And I think this has brought many lessons for us, but I think it's a good moment to have a reflection of what is at stake, which will be the second part of the presentation, and finally of kind of what needs to change. And I hope that this will give an interesting input to the discussion, and I'm looking forward and also to the time that we have for interaction then after the end of the presentation. So starting with where do we stand? So what we have seen now coming out of the COVID pandemic, the pandemic has exposed serious gaps in social protection coverage. We've seen that many categories of workers actually were not sufficiently covered in large parts of the world, but also in Europe, where we generally have relatively well placed social protection systems. And this required urgent measures to close those gaps. But at the same time, it has also become clear to what extent social protection mechanisms have really been a very important part of the policy response to the crisis. And this has been essentially through 2 channels. One channel is where the automatic responses through the existing social protection systems. So for example, obviously in countries where you had a good health protection, people had access to healthcare and could easily get the necessary treatment. They could have sickness benefits when they were sick, also when they had to quarantine, which was important to also secure their incomes. And we saw in many parts of the world where people could not afford to stay at home, that this was actually a major challenge. So, and obviously unemployment benefits, also the partial unemployment benefits or short-time work benefits were really essential in preserving jobs. So these kind of more or less automatic responses have been extremely important, but they were not sufficient. Because countries, they had really kind of to close immediate gaps, and especially those countries with weak systems, they had really to react on the go and improve coverage for those who were not adequately protected. And depending on what the pre-existing structures were, countries used whatever they had. They used social insurance, they used tax finance schemes, and challenged additional resources also through those mechanisms. But nevertheless, a lot of these measures were temporary, really one-off or short-term measures. And this leaves us in a situation where we need to rethink of where to go next, how to come to more sustainable solutions. We have seen, especially when we look at workers on digital labor platforms, I think they've been very much discussed about because, I mean, the gaps in their social protection coverage became very apparent when it comes to gaps in terms of access to healthcare, health insurance, provision for work injuries, paid sick leave, unemployment insurance, disability insurance, pensions, retirement benefits. This has really become very, very apparent. And it leaves also platform workers at very strong risk, the risk emanating from COVID-19. And we have seen that on location-based platforms, 7 out of 10 workers were not able to take paid sick leave or receive any compensation in the event that they were tested positive for the virus. So I think this is really an illustration of the gaps that exist. And if we look at the lessons learned from the response, it is really quite interesting to see how countries have reacted. What were the kind of measures, what were the kind of information they've put in place, and what is it that we could learn from. And I think there are three main lessons that we can take from them, and you'll find them in these in the yellow box. So first and foremost, that countries with solid public social protection systems were able to respond much faster and better than others. And they really showed much higher resilience at both the macro level in terms of societies, but also at the micro level. So, I mean, workers had a kind of a better situation in those countries which were able to mobilize those resources. Yet it was necessary to close coverage and adequacy gaps, extend coverage to unprotected workers. So this was necessary on the one hand, but on the other hand, it was also possible. And we saw that many countries have developed very innovative ways of doing so. And I think this is also a key lesson that we can build on for the future. And the third point at this point in time is really the need to reinforce the social protection system so that they're able to provide better protection in the future, and not just for the next crisis, but also really for every day, to give workers the peace of mind that they need actually in leading their lives. So what is at stake now? And I think I would like to start here first with breaking a bit some of the stereotypes that exist around kind of non-standard forms of work or diverse forms of work, because sometimes they're being addressed in the debate as if everyone in those forms of work were not covered. But this is certainly not true. We know that in most European countries, probably the large majority of those in those forms of, in the broad forms of employment are covered. But we know that there are certain categories of workers where this is not the case. And we also know that even those who are covered are not necessarily adequately covered. And so if we look at the kind of the different forms of kind of non-standard dependent employment, temporary workers are largely covered, and this very much depends on the question of what are the kind of the minimum thresholds with regard to the length of employment that is specified in their contract. Where there is a huge challenge is with regard to casual employment, where we see large coverage gaps. Similarly, for part-time employment, there are minimum thresholds in the legislation with regard to the regular working time. And again, the main issue there, it's not so much the regular part-time workers, because they're quite often covered, not always adequately, but at least covered. But where there is a huge issue in many countries is marginal part-time work and 0-hour contract. So when we look at multi-party employment relationships, such as temporary agency work, it very much also depends on the national legislation on how they're covered, and also not only on the legislation, but also with regard to how it is enforced. Where there is a huge challenge is with regard to dependent contractors, and sometimes also in some contexts also referred to disguised employment. And there it's really critical that there are effective mechanisms to ensure the correct classification of employment relationships. And in some countries, there are specific rules for dependent contractors. And so, but what is very critical and what is very also kind of quite hotly debated is really the question of inadequate regulation and enforcement. And then, of course, there are those who are in independent employment, that is often referred to as genuine self-employment. And here again, it really depends on the modalities when it comes to legal coverage by sector, type of profession. In some countries, they're relatively well covered. In other countries, hardly at all. And there's a lot of countries in between where some categories of self-employed workers are covered. And the question here is really, what are the legal mechanisms with regard to mandatory or voluntary coverage? Voluntary coverage is quite often not leading to high rates of effective coverage. But then also the question of how well are these mechanisms adapted to the specific situation of those self-employed workers, and how complicated and how complex is the administration around that, and how fragmented is the system. So this is just to kind of bust a bit this this myth that all workers in diverse forms of employment are not covered, which is simply not correct. But it depends. So just to say, this is not a kind of a natural law in a way. It really depends on the political decisions, and it depends on the legislation to what extent they're covered or they're not covered. But at the same time, we know that Social Security coverage is particularly important for workers in those forms of employment. And I think this is yet another argument really to make an additional effort to close coverage and adequacy gaps. And just zooming in on workers on digital platforms in that respect, and I think it's quite interesting to look a bit at some of the evidence, and here I'm looking specifically on to crowd workers, and this refers to a crowd work survey that the ILO was undertaking in 2017, and which zoomed in quite in detail in terms of their social protection coverage. I will not go through the kind of the details of the table, but I think there are some lessons to be learned there. First of all, what we see is that a large share of those crowd workers are not protected and leaving them in a very vulnerable situation. And I should say that this is a survey that was conducted on a global level. So it has quite a number of countries included in it, including, for example, quite a large number of workers in the US, in some European countries, in India, and in some other countries. And obviously these kind of national systems also play a very important role. What we can also see here is that crowd workers who engage in crowd work as a secondary source of income tend to have better access to social protection than those engaging in crowd work as a main source of income. And I think this is quite telling, in the sense that, and this is probably due to the fact that many workers who use crowd work as a secondary source of income, they're covered either through their main employment, or they're covered through a previous employment, or sometimes also through other members of the household. So on the one hand, it's good to see that they are better protected, but this obviously points to a challenge for the economy and for the society, because the question is, who pays actually for their coverage, and is there really a kind of a fair sharing of the costs that incur, especially when we think about taxation and when we think about social insurance contributions. Another element which is quite interesting is to see that crowd workers who engage in crowd work as a main income source are more likely to receive social assistance or other government benefits. So this could be interpreted in two ways. One way is that crowd work might be a way of helping them to enter into the labor market and engage in employment. But it could also mean that the earnings that those workers make on the crowd work platforms are insufficient to keep them out of poverty, so that social assistance needs to kick in. And I mean, we don't know which of these two interpretations are the correct one. Probably there is kind of some truth to both of them. But I think this is another element that again points us to this question of what are the societal implications of the way how it's organized. And finally, one final point is when we talk about crowd work, it's also the cross-border nature of work, and there is obviously a big question around who's actually responsible for providing that social protection. And that brings me to a question and really kind of trying to summarize a big or kind of some of the main questions around social protection in the age of labor market transformation, and the question of what is at stake. And I think what COVID-19 has reminded us, I mean, it has really exposed some of the pre-existing challenges. So many of them are not new, they existed before. And I've put in some of the keywords here to really see what is happening there and what is it that is challenging, or how do we need to get there in order to improve the situation. I think one of the big challenges has been the fact that in many ways economic risks have been shifted to workers. And that has created challenges really with regard to fair risk sharing and the protection of workers' rights. It has also meant that some enterprises have, well, in a way, de-responsibilized themselves. I'm not sure whether that word exists, but there has been a phenomenon of a de-responsibilization of enterprises with regard to the situation of the workers and the protection of workers' rights. But at the same time, I mean, we know that there is a fundamental power imbalance between those who benefit from the work and the workers. And I think there is a big argument to be made for the continued relevance of the employment relationship. And we then need to be very clear of whether there is an employment relationship or whether it does not exist. This has also raised issues around unfair competition in many ways, and a question of what do we need to do to get up to a kind of a fairer, competitive environment and sustainable enterprises. Again, this question about who pays, or is there something like a free rider problem with regard I mean, between some companies active in the digital economy and the kind of the more traditional employers. And I think there is an important argument also to be made to ensure that fair competitive environment for sustainable enterprises. There has been a fair degree of fragmentation, and I think we all see the need for getting to more integrated solutions. And in many ways, there are concerns about disempowerment of workers and calls for greater representation and social dialogue. We have also seen that flexibility is held up quite high as something that seemingly contradicts social security. But I think what we have seen, especially now during the COVID crisis, is that we need social security to actually support that flexibility and decent work. And if we are continuing to promote them as kind of contradictory, I think this is really creating quite a number of challenges. And finally, and this is my kind of really summing up, I mean, we have seen that in many countries there has been a fractured or even broken social contract, even before COVID-19. And I think one of the lessons is really that we need to make additional efforts to reinvigorate and repair that social contract in order to have more equitable and more sustainable solutions for the future. And so what needs to change? And I think there is given that at the moment, and I've started really by describing the situation where we are now kind of slowly coming out of the COVID crisis, hopefully. And looking at, on the one hand, on the very critical role that social protection has played in helping us through the crisis, but also where we have seen the limits and the challenges. And I think at this crossroads, it's really important and to really think about the right political choices, and to think about whether countries want to go towards a kind of a high road strategy that really helps to reinvigorate their social protection systems, investing in universal social protection systems that really try to address those challenges and get to more equitable and more sustainable solutions, or whether countries are pressed towards a low road approach of quite minimalist social protection policies and fiscal consolidation. And so basically looking at the high road to universal social protection, and obviously this is really the road that would help us to come to more equitable and sustainable solutions. This requires for us not just to look into universal coverage, but we also need to look into adequate benefit levels, quality services, a comprehensive range of benefits, making sure that the social protection systems are sustainably and equitably financed, that the provision is rights-based and inclusive, and that it is adapted to developments in the world of work. So I think this is really one of the key messages, and it's actually the key message that comes out of the most recent version of the World Social Protection Report, which has just been launched last week. So I would really like to invite you also to take a look into that report for more detail on what constitutes this kind of high road approach and the low road approach, and plenty of statistics and information about social protection worldwide. But it's not just the argument of the report, but it's all up. Sorry, let me just jump to this one right away, being conscious about the time. But it's also the conclusions of the International Labour Conference, which has discussed those issues in June. And the International Labour Conference is basically the Parliament of Labour, the International Parliament of Labour. This is how it's often described. And there's not just governments around the table of the ILO's 187 member states, but there's also workers and employers. And you can imagine that this dialogue and kind of the search for a compromise is not always easy. But I think once it's such a compromise and such a kind of a conclusion, a jointly supported conclusions have been found, they're quite powerful, because they really represent a balanced interest and a balanced roadmap for the future. And so what the International Labour Conference has agreed to comes in 5 points, and that actually comes from 2 specific documents that have been adopted. One is a global call to action for a human-centered recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, and the second one is more specific on social protection. It's a resolution and conclusion on social protection, social security. So what are these 5 points that I would like to highlight here? Unsurprisingly, the conference has really put the issue of reinforcing social protection systems really very high up the agenda, because they have recognized that this is really essential to adequately respond to change and to help people to better navigate the work and life transitions. And we know that these are happening more and more. And I think it's important to really enable and empower people actually to make those transitions, not least in the context of a just transition to a more environmentally sustainable society and economy. And so this is really quite a strong call for universal social protection in the way I have described with the high road. The second one is ensuring adequate social protection for workers in all types of employment. And I think this is an important message that also, I mean, it echoes also some of the elements, for example, of the European Pillar of Social Rights. It reflects some of the agreements that the G20 have found in recent years, and really ensuring that the social protection is extended to everyone. I mean, not necessarily in the sense of a one-size-fits-all concept, but it needs to be clear that everyone needs to be adequately protected. And we have all seen during the COVID-19 crisis that even those who seemed to get on relatively well suddenly discovered how vulnerable they were. And in order to do that, I think one of the most kind of common ways of doing it is a combination of contributory and non-contributory schemes. Looking in particular at a combination of social insurance and tax finance benefit. So social insurance, because it has really the potential of risk sharing and inclusivity, given that it provides a very kind of large risk pool, and it has also the state behind as a to guarantee the coverage and also to step in if necessary. And I think some of the biggest challenges here are really for those countries which have incomplete coverage of those in part-time, temporary employment, also temporary agency employment and self-employed workers, to really make additional efforts to extend coverage to them and ensure that this is adequate. But I think there is also a very strong role for tax finance benefit, and this has a key role in providing and guaranteeing a social protection floor to make sure that everyone has access at least to health care and a basic level of income security. And I think this is absolutely critical in moving forward. Another important point that has been mentioned, and I think this kind of later sessions will come back to that topic, is securing the legal certainty for our workers and employers, ensuring the correct classification of employment relationships, preventing the informalization of employment, and facilitating transitions from the informal to the formal economy. And this is necessary to ensure both the adequacy and the sustainability of national social protection systems, building on effective social dialogue, and based on some of the core principles that we have for social protection systems, like solidarity, collective financing, well-balanced intergenerational fairness, and the achievement of gender equality. And I think it's important also to situate social protection in the broader policy context, because it doesn't exist in a vacuum, but it's important to look also at its connections to the broader policy context. So policies to protect all workers, also with regard to labor protection, looking at wage policies, for example, looking at occupational safety and health and other aspects. Policies to promote inclusive economic growth and employment based on social dialogue in order for decent work and social justice. So I think I'll stop here. I have skipped a couple of slides, so those who would like to take a look at the presentation, you'll find some more, and you'll find a long list also of references that might be interesting to look at. But I think I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.